You have to have free public deliberation for self-government to be genuine. Any law that intrudes upon freedom of speech and the press is highly suspect and is going to require a lot of justification from the government. There's a difference, an essential difference between the use of a right and the abuse of a right. The Supreme Court's job in the United States system, part of its job, is to interpret the Constitution and to decide if a law conflicts with the Constitution. And if it does, the law will have to be overturned or voided as inconsistent with the Constitution. That's been the approach from the beginning. But the Supreme Court has changed the standards in some areas under which it exercises that responsibility. The traditional approach was to defer to the government and sort of start from the assumption that any law that's been enacted by a legislature, whether it's the Congress of the United States or a state legislature, is constitutional. And it will be up to someone challenging it to show that it's unconstitutional. So the scales are kind of weighted in favor of the government protecting community standards. That changed over the 20th century. The Supreme Court adopted theories according to which freedom of speech and of the press are to be viewed as, quote unquote, preferred freedoms or fundamental rights. And in the modern jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, those rights trigger a special kind of judicial review according to which the presumption of constitutionality is actually reversed. And so the modern Supreme Court will treat any law that regulates speech and press as presumptively unconstitutional. They're going to presume that it's in conflict with the requirements of the First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech and the press, and they're going to lean upon the government to demonstrate the necessity of that law. So under the modern standards, it's really the case that the scales are established at the beginning against the government. So I think that's one general way of understanding the American experience and why America is so much more permissive in regards to speech and press than maybe other modern democracies. A lot of it's not because of the decisions or the priorities of any given administration, any given executive administration. It's more the kind of settled drift of American constitutional jurisprudence over the last couple of generations. I mean, since the 1960s up till now. And I would emphasize that this approach unifies the members of the Supreme Court of the United States, for example, regardless of their party antecedents, whether they're Republican nominees or Democratic nominees, they all agree that any law that intrudes upon freedom of speech and the press is highly suspect and is going to require a lot of justification from the government. America has not had the same experiences as Germany has had, right? We've had the same regime basically from the founding up until now, with the exception of the great disruption of the American Civil War, which the North won and the country was held together. We've never had an experience since our founding of a disruption in the continuity of our tradition of democratic government. We never had a non-democratic, authoritarian, or fascist regime the way Germany had in the early part of the 20th century. So it's not part of our history that I think Americans feel like they have to worry about it as much. And so, I mean, part of the reason that I think Americans will tolerate the publication of the swastika, or from both extremes, left and right. Americans will tolerate the Communist Party of the United States, even though most Americans are not communists. They would tolerate a Nazi party. Why? It's not because they think those things are good or morally indifferent. They just think that they're utterly irrelevant and that they are not mainstream and that there is no realistic chance that they will have any influence on American politics. And other countries have a very different experience of that, understandably. So that's part of it, along with the fact that if you tried to ban those parties or those symbols, you would run up against the Supreme Court and the modern, very permissive standards, and they would tell you you're not allowed to do that. The American standards are different as regards freedom of the press and of speech in relation to, say, print publications and things like that versus broadcast media. You're talking about bleeping out words. We're talking about radio and television. And so those have always been handled in America under somewhat different standards. Now, I wouldn't say that the First Amendment does not apply to them, but it doesn't apply as directly or as robustly, because the traditional understanding was that, I mean, you can't have a kind of Wild West environment in which everybody's just broadcasting television or radio, because then it would be chaotic. The reason broadcasters have to get a license is because the understanding is that the airwaves are public property. And since you couldn't have a situation in which everybody broadcasts willy-nilly, I guess they'd all jam each other or cancel each other out. You have to grant licenses to broadcasters to broadcast on a certain frequency. And since that's understood as a public trust, there are stricter regulations for that, obscenity standards that would say, you couldn't say certain words on broadcast TV. And all that's a kind of established by the Federal Communications Commission. And there's a bunch of regulations, and they vary depending upon what time of day the things are being said, because the standards would be different if you're thinking children are in view than if not. I would emphasize one thing at the beginning, that from a technical point of view, I don't think the courts of the United States or American law would treat some of these social media platforms as broadcast platforms in the same way that radio and TV are, because they can disseminate their materials without getting a license, so to speak. So they're going to handle that differently. Now, having said that, the traditional standards that I mentioned earlier would still apply to them. You're not allowed to engage in defamatory communication, for example. All those kind of traditional principles that limit the abuse of a freedom would still be in play. I would say in the first place that certainly these large corporations that provide social media platforms have every right to regulate what they provide according to their own moral standards. And that does not create any constitutional problem in the United States. Freedom of speech of the press is a freedom that you hold as against the government. That's important to go back to. The First Amendment's text says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. And now we understand that in contemporary times to also apply to America's state governments as well. So there's an important distinction in America between controls on speech that are implemented by the government, which are highly suspect constitutionally, and then controls on speech that are imposed by other entities that are not as problematic. I mean, there's all kinds of complications regarding this because there are lots of civil rights laws that control like employment standards and things like that. But at least as regards the First Amendment, let's say, if a social media platform wants to just not provide its service for certain kinds of speech that they regard as offensive or improper or harmful, they're totally allowed to do that. And a lot of them would think that they have a social or moral responsibility to do that. And they're very free to do that. It's going to be more difficult in the American context for the federal government to make them do anything like that. There are extreme cases where they could, but the modern Supreme Court's approach will be highly skeptical of any government effort to regulate those things. Well, that's a very interesting and difficult question, I think. And I can only say that I think both sides of that question have to be respected. I mean, when countries are friends and allies, it's certainly legitimate for them to counsel each other where they think that they're making a mistake. And it is the case, inevitably, it seems to me, based upon my knowledge of political history, that nations will take an interest in each other's internal affairs if they feel some kind of moral affinity, either for that nation, like a kind of friendship, or if they feel a concern for people within that country who are vulnerable and think need to be protected. So that's one way of saying that all nations kind of butt into each other's business if they think there's something there they care enough about. But it's also a very generally respectable principle, of course, to say that you have to leave each country alone to govern itself. I think that's very deeply rooted in America's traditions as well. I mean, the Declaration of Independence's standards are stated as universal principles. Nevertheless, the American founders understood that each nation has to decide for itself whether it's going to have its own revolution to instantiate those principles or not. And they generally took the view that sovereign nations should mind each other's, or mind their own business rather, and not interfere too much in what other countries are doing. So I think it's fair for countries to admonish each other and to counsel each other. But I would say don't interfere too much in each other's internal business, because while we can all agree that we have to respect freedom of speech and of the press, different nations do have different experiences that establish limits for them. And even in, as I tried to explain earlier, sketching America's history, the American standards were a lot more restrictive at the time of the founding than they are now. So America even has experience with restrictive standards regarding freedom of speech and of the press. The Supreme Court of the United States has said this many times, and the American founders thought about this as well. You have to have free public deliberation for self-government to be genuine. I mean, you can permit people to vote, and that's, of course, one of the very fundamental requirements of self-government, and we're grateful for that. But if they're not allowed to freely express their opinions, then when it comes time for them to vote, they're not going to be making an informed choice. I mean, to take one kind of crude example, if you allowed everyone to vote and you had competitive elections in that sense, but the ruling party was allowed to outlaw all criticism of its own policies, you would not feel like that is real democracy, because no one would have a fair chance to point out the errors or the mistakes or the misdoings of that government. So I think everybody kind of agrees, even though we have debates about what the proper limits are, I think everybody agrees that there does have to be robust freedom to criticize the government in order to have genuine democracy. And then most people too would extend that further to kind of a robust freedom to criticize social developments or cultural developments or what have you, just because that's part of the process by which people commonly build a culture, by criticizing and also affirming what each other are doing. I think so, or I want to put it this way: the American founders, the men of that generation, laid a lot of emphasis on the distinction between freedom on the one hand, or liberty on the one hand, and on the other hand, license or licentiousness. And freedom meant the freedom to speak your mind, for example, or to do any other thing within just limits established by accepted public morality and principles of natural law or something like that. Whereas license or licentiousness would mean the freedom to do or say just whatever you feel like without any regard for other people's rights or the good of the community. And they did not believe in that. They thought licentiousness was distinct from liberty and should not be tolerated and is subject to governmental regulation. Or another way they would put it is there's a difference, an essential difference between the use of a right and the abuse of a right. You know, if you have a right to build a home on your own property, that's one thing. If in the process of building it, you damage your neighbor's property, you're now beyond the exercise of your own right, and you're doing something that hurts somebody else. The same thing can be applied to freedom of speech. So if we take that distinction seriously, I would want to say, in the spirit of the American founders, there really cannot be too much freedom of speech, but there must not be licentiousness of speech. So speech that is injurious to somebody else's reputation, for example, libel or defamation, that's not a proper exercise of free speech. That would be the way the founders would think about it, and I would want to think about it along the same lines as they do.